Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. My name is Kristen McCarthy, and I serve as the Director of Grants and Operations at FMEP and the author of FMEP's weekly report on Israeli settlement activity. Today, I am so excited to be joined by Avner Kvaryahu, the Executive Director of the Israeli NGO Breaking the Silence. Thanks so much for making the time for us today, Avner.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
So, in case you don't know, Breaking the Silence is an Israeli organization of veterans who are talking about their experience serving in the Israeli military, specifically in the occupied territories. If you don't know about Breaking the Silence, I really urge you to learn more about it. Visit their website, read their reports, and if you are able to, as travel opens up again, please take a tour with their staff of Hebron or the South Hebron Hills. They are life-changing tours. The topic of today's podcast is actually based on a new collection of testimonies that Breaking the Silence has just published. It's called On Duty, Settler Violence in the West Bank. The collection shares 36 testimonies from soldiers who have observed, participated in, and were sometimes victims of settler violence. So to dive into all of these things, we are here with Avner, and I want to start this conversation by just first asking you to explain to us what settler violence means. Like, what do we mean when we say that kind of two-word phrase that encompasses so much?
So, I think when we think about settler violence, the first image that comes to mind, and these are images that we've seen numerous times when it comes to the occupied territories, are many times young males who are throwing stones or slingshots, sometimes attacking with clubs. This could happen in various places around the West Bank. There are cases of, obviously, that are much more extreme from stone throwing. There were cases of Molotov cocktails that were thrown. There were boulders that were thrown that caused deaths. But the image is usually sort of that. But I think it's important to break that down a bit, because that's definitely an element in settler violence. But in order to really understand settler violence, we have to sort of zoom out, and understanding the system of violence really, I think is a key element in understanding the occupation today. A lot of the violence that we're referring to is violence that takes place in rural areas, even though that's not only, and we see more violence within villages or smaller urban communities. There's obviously violence within the urban area of Hebron, and extreme violence, but many of the violence takes place in rural areas, and not all, but many take place around the outskirts of settlements and unauthorized settlements, which are both illegal under international law, but under Israeli law there's a distinction. And around the edges of the settlements, or these unauthorized settlements, or outposts as they're called, we see really the center of the fight over the land, and specifically over what people refer to as Area C, which is an area that was called Area C as an outcome of the mid-90s Oslo Agreement. Almost all the settlers live in Area C, and we're talking about a pretty big community of Palestinians, between 150,000 to 200,000, depends on who and how you count, and over 100, plus 150,000 more, give or take, that work on the land. So when we talk about the settler violence, the violence is many times over that land, and we can see violence that takes place with illegal expansion of outposts, basically stealing land. We can see settler violence that is sort of hand to glove between the military and the settler community in taking over land. And I would say one of the best examples of understanding the element of settler violence is the dynamic that happens between settlers and Palestinian shepherds, where we can see over and over again Palestinians who are herding sheep on their own lands. The moment there'll be any kind of friction, doesn't have to be physical violence per se, but the moment there'll be any friction, could be screaming, it could be yelling, it could be preventing Palestinians to just move and graze their land. The military will, if the military will come in, the automatic response will be to separate two parties. Now that makes sense if you have some sort of system of equality, or if you had a law enforcement system that's there in order to protect both communities. What happens in those moments is that the Palestinians and the settlers will be separated, but the settlers have basically succeeded in preventing Palestinians from grazing their land. And this is just one example of a process that allows massive land grab, and not only land grab that prevents Palestinians from using the land, but also expansion of settlers. So at the edge, we see the settler throwing the stone, but there's an entire ecosystem of violence.
Yeah, and it goes from, personal injury of Palestinians to taking land forcefully or burning fields, and it's this, layered violence that Palestinian communities in Area C specifically, but as you said, increasingly in other parts of the West Bank are facing.
True, and I'll just add one more point. I mean, many of the settlers that live inside the even the big settlement blocks, but even in the smaller settlements, are not constantly in friction with Palestinians, or definitely not day in day out hundreds of settlers going and taking part in this violence. That's important to say, but they definitely enjoy the violence that is taking place because it allows them to expand their settlements. And I think this is one of the points that's important to make: the connection between the official settler security coordinators and the military and the settler violence. And I think that's a big part of what comes up from our testimonies.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think another thing that comes up too, for me, if you're reading it in a historic sense, is that, settler violence is very routine, and IDF participation, witnessing of settler violence is routine. It's a normal daily in and out of life in the West Bank, right? But I think the media has talked about surges in settler violence routinely. Like every time there's something happens, that we talk about it like this is a surge, this is a surge. And in your introduction to this new report, you actually talk about how settler violence has escalated over a year or two, that this isn't just like a ebb and flow situation, that it's growing and growing. Can you help us understand what it's like in the West Bank right now? Do you understand this to be a surge, or just are things deteriorating, are tensions growing, not return back to a lower level?
Right. I mean, I think it is, just important to say, obviously as Israeli, living in Tel Aviv, I spend a lot of time in the West Bank, but I don't live under occupation. I myself was part of this occupation. I'm definitely not a victim, but a victimizer. And I think that's the angle that's important for us to bring to the table, as an addition to the voices of Palestinians who are living under this reality day in and day out. And I think that there's definitely increase in documentation from Palestinian families, activists, organizations, of this increase in violence in a variety of areas across the West Bank. I think one point that is important to make is this isn't only testimonies or anecdotal incidents from a variety of places, but There's many different bodies that have been documenting this violence, many amazing anti-occupation human rights organizations. But it's important to note that actually the Israeli security forces also document settler violence. And the way they document the violence is usually pretty minimal. And what they'll call violence is many times the sort of higher level of violence, and ignore other cases. But even according to the Israeli official sources, we're talking about in 2020 close to 400 different events of violence. That about 10% more or less of them are towards Israeli security forces. Now, that's an increase from the previous year. And there's even a specific moment where we saw this increase, and this definitely had to do with COVID and sort of basic lack of rule of law in these territories when it comes to Israeli citizens, settlers living there. But there was a moment in 2020 where a young settler was, from what we know, throwing stones on Palestinian vehicles. Again, this is what we know from the press, and that the police was trying to stop this stone throwing. And in the chase, there was the car with the settlers turned over, and this young settler was allegedly throwing stones, was killed. And this was seen as the fault of the police. And maybe yes, maybe no, I don't know the details, but this was sort of some of the background story for an increase in settler violence. And this phenomenon that many people, that settlers, but many people have referred to as price tag, right, which is sort of a euphemism for violence and, in some cases, terrorism, and this was basically seen as a reason to attack Palestinians. And the way the mindset works in this concept of the price tag is it doesn't matter who does something wrong to the settlers, or what they see as something wrong could be attacks by Palestinians, but it could also be demolitions of illegal outposts. It could be a case like this. The community that will pay the price are the Palestinians, right? So this starts with spray painting regards from this and that outpost. That continues on to stone throwing or more extreme cases of violence. And we definitely see an increase in specific areas, specifically the South Hebron Hills, an area that we know very well. This has almost become on a weekly basis that big groups of settlers attack Palestinian families or shepherds, or try to prevent shepherds from accessing their water cisterns in the area. And we see sort of massive attacks of young Israeli settlers, where some of them cover their face, some of them don't, where the soldiers in many cases really stand idly by. But we also have seen cases where soldiers themselves take part in some of these attacks. And I think this is definitely not a new phenomenon, but it's definitely I think the level and amount of times that we see these events reoccurring that are getting to I think new highs.
Yeah. So I have so many questions based on that, what you just laid out, which is horrifying. But can you start by helping our listeners understand? Talk to us about the relationship between the individual soldier who serves in the West Bank and the system in which he or she operates under. Why would a soldier be in a situation to participate in attacks on Palestinian land, property, individuals, and B, to watch it, to not intervene? How can this circumstance be? That doesn't seem very logical.
Yeah. So first, it is important to say, I mean, that soldiers are very violent generally, and this is a big part of our documentation. There
Yeah.
isn't a way to maintain, a military dictatorship like we have in the occupied territories without force.
Yes.
And there's so many cases of violence that we've seen. The involvement of soldiers in actually joining in on attacks on with settlers is something that we're seeing more of, but is definitely rarer than just seeing soldiers standing idly by. But I do think the dynamic is important to sort of break down. Well, I served myself as a soldier I was a paratrooper between 2004 and 2007. I served most around Nablus and Jenin, north of the West Bank. I was a sergeant of a snipers team, and a big part of my service was actually in big Palestinian cities in what we call Area A. So Nablus, Jenin, and in the areas in between, the refugee camps in between. And I didn't have a lot of interaction with the settler community. But in the first part of my service, when I was a younger soldier, we were sent for a few weeks to different places around the West Bank. Usually this was weekends. So instead of going home, we had to stay and with sort of, stayed in the army. And we were sent to go guard settlements or outposts. I actually had the opportunity to serve in the South Hebron Hills, and a community that I know very well today, and the people there are very dear to my heart. The Palestinians living in Susia, and some of the families there that I've known for over a decade now. I was the one protecting the settlers, and I was the one preventing them from accessing land and so on. And thinking back about this dynamic, when I think about myself back then, it's not that I was there, just trying to make Palestinians' lives more difficult. What I thought I was doing was trying to make the lives of the settlers more secure, and that's the prism that soldiers, Israeli soldiers, look at, and that's sort of integral to this concept in the territories where we have two separate legal systems. The system is not by the people for the people; it's by Israel for Israel. And even though legally, Israeli soldiers and myself, I had the ability legally to stop settler violence. As the ruler of the land, there is the military that's occupied by military might. I didn't do that, not because I didn't want to, but because what I was told is that my job is to protect the settlers from the Palestinians.
Yeah.
And the job of who was it to protect the Palestinians from the settlers? Not the soldiers, only police. And there's no police there. So when I was sent to guard the settlement of Susia, the person giving me orders when I got there was a settler. He's a security guard of the settler who gets his salary from different municipal bodies and the Ministry of Defense, and he's in charge of the local security there, subordinate to the military. But as young soldiers, that was my first time there as a soldier. My officer didn't know much more than me, to be honest, and the settler knows the area. He lives there. So he was the one telling us where the borders are. He was the one framing the situation. But additionally, we were there in Susia for, I think it was a week. My family has close friends living in Susia. I mean, friends, childhood friends of my parents, and we were there for the weekend for Friday and Saturday, and we were invited over to have Friday night dinners with the families. Now, it's a nice thing for them to do, to invite soldiers, and obviously soldiers would prefer to eat a nice Shabbat dinner than to have the horrible food we get on the base. So you have a nice Shabbat meal with the community there. You're invited into their homes, and you're there to protect them. So it's a really sort of hand to glove situation, and in the mindset of a soldier, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And I think that part of what we have to understand, that as long as we will have the system of military control, where the Israeli settlers are living there, Israeli soldiers are there to protect their fellow citizens, we will always continue to see this unequal system, which is basically built to be unequal. It's not a system that has a potential for equality. So when you get to the edge of this, when you see settler expansion, when you see settlers building illegally, when you see settlers expanding into Palestinian lands, when you see settlers kicking Palestinians off their land, it's always in a specific prism. And the prism is basically, we're basically on the same team. And I think that's sort of an integral element of the occupation, that the testimonies of the soldiers explain very, very well how settler violence is not happening unnoticed. It's noticed, but the system, the military, the state, basically understand that even though they don't support, per se, the settler violence, it's part of a system that allows settlement expansion.
Yeah. I mean, so many of the testimonies talk about this duty that soldiers, individual soldiers, feel to protect the settlers and not the Palestinians, and are invited into homes regularly and then shunned or even punished by settlers if they intervene, if the soldier intervenes to even stop settlers from doing something outrageous. It's an amazing collection of testimonies. I again just point our listeners to the report that they can find on your website. And I think what you laid out too just helps us understand why, like, sometimes I think in the West or in other countries, when we read about settler violence, a lot of times it's connected to the same exact communities, whether it's the Yitzhar settlement, outside of Nablus, and this whole area in Nablus or in Hebron. It's like, well, if you know what the problem is and where the problem is coming from, why can't the army and the IDF go in and put an end to it? And I mean, I welcome any addition to helping my troubled mind understand these communities that not only terrorize Palestinians, but pose a significant problem for the Israeli government and their enforcement of rule of law. I mean, they have no regard for Israeli law, it seems.
Yeah, that's sort of the $1 million question, right? I mean, we see a community that has total disregard to law, and almost every settlement has an outpost, which is basically a criminal enterprise that the state either funds or allows to go down, retroactively funds and so on. But I think a part of a way to understand it is actually in the testimonies, and there's a testimony of a guy who served in special ops unit, and he talks about an incident that happened, while he was serving, where there was someone who served alongside him, who lived in one of these settlements, one of these violent settlements, which obviously happens. They're Israeli citizens who live, born and raised in the settlements. 18, 19, they joined the army. Yep. So this guy who was born and raised in the settlement, was, in the army, goes back home. He has his military gun. He has his rifle. And there was a video that was published by B'Tselem, actually, of a settler with a gun who was caught on video burning a Palestinian field. This guy was a soldier who was basically home on leave, right? So when we try to disconnect the military from the settlers, or why does the system, so this is only just one example of one settler, anecdotal, right? But take this and multiply it. Take this and break down the fact that in some of the outposts across the West Bank, including some in the South Hebron Hills, you have many members of the illegal outposts, illegal settlement under Israeli law, who are who their career is in the military, who high-ranking officers in the military. So it's not that the military, that there's they're scheming in some back rooms of saying, how are we going to help the settlers burn the fields, and how are we going to make sure that doesn't happen, at least not that we know of. But we definitely see a system that sometimes, as we mentioned, there's sometimes settlers who attack military and police. But with that said, we have sort of this triangle of control where the system of control by the state prevents Palestinians' expansion, home demolitions. This doesn't allow communities to be connected to water. On the other hand, you have massive military control and extreme law enforcement over these communities, which is backed by settler organizations like Regavim. And this is sort of the addition to that, is the settler lack of law enforcement, which could be, as we said, a variety of acts of violence. So this sort of triangle, even though doesn't always work 100% together, eventually does the exact same thing, and that is kick Palestinians off their land and allow settlements to expand. And it's a very orchestrated process that many have documented. Yesh Din, which is human rights organization, legal human rights organizations, has documented this very well in a bunch of their reports. B'Tselem has as well, and many others have really shown this process of this triangle that really pushes Palestinians out on the one hand and allows settlers to go in and expand, build new settlements, and then the cycle happens again.
Yeah. So my last question for you today is about breaking that cycle. What do you hope to achieve by publishing this set of testimonies? And I mean, I know that's a question that's really goes to the heart and mission of Breaking the Silence as an organization, but if there's any other more immediate goals or opportunities or points of leverage that you're hoping to achieve or working towards achieving with this set of testimonies, what are those? How can this get better?
There's always a question, and this is true to any issue of human rights worldwide, especially in a systemic system of violence like the occupation. Do you sort of work in conflict or on conflict, right? Do you sort of tackle sort of the classic human rights approach of tackle issue by issue, or do you say, look, there's a systemic problem, we have to see how we can tackle that? Historically, Breaking the Silence was, always talking about, the problem is the occupation. The problem is not fixing or bettering the occupation, because as those who carried out the occupation, we understand that the problem was not with one specific thing we did, but the entire system we were part of. It's not only about making sure that you clean up the house after you barged in or smile in a checkpoint, but make sure you don't barge into homes and don't control Palestinian lives. So the issue is definitely a systemic issue. With that said, I think that specifically looking at this phenomenon of settler violence, there is an ability, I think, to showcase how widespread it is. I think definitely to the Israeli public, but to the international community as well, and also to show how much it is connected to the actions of the military, because there's a sense sometimes that sort of this is a phenomenon we cannot control, this violence, which is obviously false. This is done by people and the system that allows it. And I think that's the first point. But the second point is, uh, there still is, because we're in this reality of military occupation that must end. It is important to say that soldiers do have the responsibility to stop settler violence. And it's amazing. And you read this in the testimonies, soldiers don't know that basic fact. I didn't know that basic fact. I really didn't know that basic fact. Now it maybe sounds absurd to some of our listeners, but again, looking through the prism that I described earlier, this is part of why this system of control is so problematic, because it really is only built to provide for one side. And I think that they're bringing it forward definitely to opinion makers here in Israel, making sure that this is on the table of the Minister of Defense and the Minister of Interior Affairs, who are in charge both of the military and the police, that they know that this is happening, that they do have tools to at least make sure the military understands their responsibility. I think that's important. I don't think it will end occupation, but I do think that is an important step, that in the bare minimum, could at least expose the falsehood that we hear often, that we're only seeing some rotten apples that are not connected to a larger system, but actually explain this hand to glove reality that we see happening on the ground. So if we could do that, I think that's important. And I will add that we had in the past week a massive billboard in Jerusalem that anyone entering the city could see, a campaign that we've been running, trying to make our voices heard on the media, sitting down with elected officials in order to make sure that they know the severity of these actions, but also their responsibility in speaking out against it, and for them to not stand idly by.
Great. Well, on that note, we're going to have to end it today. Thank you so much for your time today, Avner, and for this new collection of testimonies that I think is an important part in documenting what settler violence looks like and IDF complicity in that. You can find, all of our listeners can find this report. It's called On Duty on the Breaking the Silence website, which is breakingthesilence.org.il. And you can also donate to support their work, sign up for tours, and read all of their resources. Can't recommend it highly enough. Please also check out the FMEP website for resources. We have upcoming events and more. You can dive deeper into all of these issues on both of our websites. Thank you so much for tuning in today. With that, I am Kristen McCarthy signing off. Until the next time.